Yep, my name's Gary Sigworth. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and I'm the hatchery manager for Big Spring Trout Hatchery in northeast Iowa, Clayton County, near Elkader. And Big Spring is one of 3 trout hatcheries in northeast Iowa. There's one at Decorah, one at Manchester, and one at Big Spring then. And Big Spring is the largest spring in Iowa. And this is part of an urban stocking program that we haul fish basically throughout the state. I mean, we go as far as Council Bluff even hauling trout just to create a promotional recreational fishery of a species that normally isn't found in that area. And so we hope that this is a catalyst for, introduction to trout fishing for people locally, and that then they would come to northeast Iowa and try out some of the streams in northeast Iowa, because it's a unique part of Iowa where the glaciers haven't been for 500,000 years, and the topography is totally different there, and a lot of cold water streams, deep valleys, and just a totally different place to discover. You may have to move your stuff if you don't mind. I'm going to have to come in probably pretty close to where you guys are at. Gonna get you. Yep. Right there, actually. Oh, man. The water's definitely warmer than the water in our tank. If we wouldn't have had that cold last night, it probably would have been too warm. Wait for fish a second. Yeah, yep. They're about a little over a half pound each. There's the light, there we go. And they're nice fish, actually, really
Yeah,
nice
those are
fish.
fatties.
All rainbows. This lake stocking today is one of about 18 different urban lakes we have throughout Iowa. We have 6 out of Big Spring, and you know it's about a 3-hour haul to get here for us. Did the water come up butts this year on this lake? One more guess. Big Spring.
Big Spring.
The largest spring in Iowa. If you've never been there, it's a neat place. We moved out all the fingerlings August 20th, and about 200,000 of them. You know, it was through the night. We got about 4 inches from the top of our levee, and then about just when I hauled back the last load of them back that night, we got, and it came up again, and it didn't get as high then, but we're like a mini New Orleans.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And so all that water's flowing through there, and so when it doesn't flow up by gravity, we got to be pumping it all out of there.
Oh. A lot of action on that, so he likes that one. And of course, like, you know, different colors. These are traditional colors that manufacturers, again, they used to make. So, but it's, again, if you don't like ice fishing, you can still fish in the wintertime. Yeah.
Well, this is the vise, and that's what holds the hook. Probably the most important tool in the box, because if the hook is not held tight, it's pretty hard to do any work at all. So I always bend the barb off from the hook to make it barbless. That way, you actually hook the fish more easily without the barb than you do with the barb. And without the barb, it's easier to release the fish. So you've got the vise that holds the hook. You have scissors, shears to cut the thread, cut various materials. This is a bobbin, like on a sewing machine. It holds the thread, or tying thread. So we've tied this off, and now you hold your thread out of the way, and you build a base. This is called a bodkin, which can be used to clean the hook eye out with, or to apply some cement, or to pick at whatever you want. You might be tying a dry fly and you want to pick out the materials so they look buggy and fuzzy. So that's what you can use there. And then you go on to all sorts of tools. There are tools for making what they call dubbing loops, and there are tools for this and brushes. This is a stiff brush that gunsmiths use, but you can use it to rough up the materials to again make your fly look buggy. So that gives you just the basic knowledge of the tools you use. Material-wise, if we were to make a very good little bluegill fly, we've got our hook. I'm going to put some weight on it. Get this tag end off. You don't do that with your good shears. Take some turns of thread over the lead so that it'll stay in place. This is just a regular barnyard chicken. This is a grizzly or a Plymouth Rock. A lot of your domestic chickens, you can use them, but fly tyers like the longer, narrower feathers because they're stiff. And if you wanted a dry fly, you see that'll stand up on the water. So some of these chickens are bred to be like this. They're very, very expensive. What I'm doing is I'm preparing something that will be the legs on this bug or a caterpillar. Wrapping back over the top of that chenille because I want a fatter body. And I return the thread back to the eye. Just bring the material up to the eye and tie it off. Generally, you take about 5 turns up through the material.
I think there's some, there have been some, because there's, somebody said there's.
I think there was something out in San Jose.
And you want to tie off your materials, and this is just a series of overhand knots. It's called the whip finish.
I had my spotting scope, I was checking out to see if there's neck collars, I didn't see any.
They haven't put any collars on quite a few years.
Haven't they? There were 2 honkers out there that had neck collars earlier,
Oh, really?
2 white ones.
White one?
I seen that in the, there's nothing in the field.
Now, a lot of trout fishermen in northeast Iowa use this
And geese were coming from the
particular
cemetery,
bug,
I think.
and they trim the hackles.
Seen 2 neck collars there, that's where I saw them,
Where you hunting over there?
right behind Montford's plant, right where they park the trailers,
Deer or geese?
deer.
So they haven't. I've been working on a new parking right now, trying to figure out, thinking about working on powers of hand to open up fields, say for geese. Because they're landing in town.
Right.
There's other states that have ordinances that allow it, and there's no reason we shouldn't.
Right.
You get permission from the landowner. East 18th Avenue, those fields are zoned, they're in the city limits, and they're zoned.
Close enough for my
That's a
boat.
very good little bluegill fly. trout fly. Simple as can be. It's probably the first fly that you learn to tie,
A couple times this year.
and everything you build from then on. You know, a slow retrieve, make your cast and let the fly settle in. And if you're fishing around lily pads or whatever, if you know a place where the bluegill might be, chances are you'll catch bluegills. And I know you'll catch trout on this, fishing it the same way. They are alive.
Yeah. Just a quick life cycle lesson. Again, this is the adult. It causes almost no damage to the tree. It does a little bit of feeding on the leaves, but so minimal that it doesn't hurt the tree at all. This is the larvae stage, which does all of the damage. And as I was saying at the beginning when I handed out the samples out, see the bell-shaped body segments that look like the Liberty Bell? That's a unique identifying trait of this larvae. So there's all kinds of other, white-colored maggots or larvae that will get into your trees, but they won't have those bell-shaped segments. So that's something that's important. And then the adult, and this is the stage that causes all of the damage, because they're basically eating their way through the tree's sapwood and phloem and cambium layers. But they turn into, they metamorph or pupate, turn into an adult, and then they chew their way out of the tree, which is the exit holes that you saw in the bark. And once they exit, they leave that D-shaped hole, then the adult goes and munches on the leaves just a little bit, reproduce, and then the adult female lays her eggs on the bark, and then the eggs hatch and turn back into larvae. You don't usually see the activity of woodpeckers on our native insect larvae like we've seen with this one. This is brand new to us. The way that woodpeckers will demolish these ash trees, I'll show you a picture in a minute. That's been unique and new, I think. Sometimes I'll see an elm that really looks beat up by the woodpeckers, but it's pretty incredible the amount of tissue that gets eaten away by these larvae. So when we go look at the towns in Michigan, in Ohio, in Ontario, and then coming this way that have had emerald ash borer for 10 or 15 years now, there's 0 to 10% ash trees that have eaten through or gotten through. And you never quite know if they're just still alive temporarily and the ash borer might even still be inside them or still might come and get them from this point. So it's pretty heavy mortality. The ones that are making school, getting through the cracks and surviving, the researchers from the Forest Service and universities are out there trying to copy their genetics and try to save that species, thinking those might have something that makes them resistant. The obligatory before and after shot. Again, this is the situation where, if your entire neighborhood is just one species of monocultured ash trees, I think it makes good sense to go in and at least reduce the number of ash trees and replace them now. Maybe not annihilate the whole thing, but get started with replacement. I mean, trees just take a long time to get up to speed and get the benefits that you want for shade and energy conservation and land value and home residential property values. So the sooner you can get started on that, the better with replacing those. So when will it come in Marshalltown? Your guess is as good as mine. There's a very good chance that it might already be here and we just haven't found it yet, based on the way the maps you saw earlier play out. It's kind of got us surrounded. But again, it doesn't fly very far on its own. This is a great shot, by the way, of early symptoms of, you see the crown die back and thinning and yellowing, and then this is what we call epicormic sprouts or water sprouts, and that's a sign of stress of that tree. And that is the effect of the borers working up here and coming down. So the tree's trying to resprout below the point of contact. So in 2015, the city of Marshalltown signed up for a grant program through us and the U.S. Forest Service, and we enlisted the help of about 20 volunteers and the city staff, and we went through and blanketed the whole town and inventoried every public tree in town, parks and streets, and looked at basically every ash tree in town, not on private properties, but on public properties, and looked for signs and symptoms of emerald ash borer, and we didn't turn anything up. So that should give you at least a little bit of peace of mind. But we're doing that across Iowa. We've probably inventoried just like that a third of the towns in Iowa, I would just guess. So the DNR is doing some of it. The Iowa Department of Agriculture is out there looking. The USDA has pest agencies that are out there looking. This is just a picture that kind of nicely illustrates, this is the minimal damage that this adult stage does when it chews on leaves. And we call that leaf notching. That's another thing that's kind of unique. I think there are some other insects that would do that to ash trees during the summer months. But definitely the adult phase of the emerald ash borer does that. And it creates these little notches in the leaves. This is a really important picture right here because there are a lot of other, surprising number of other metallic green insects in Iowa and the Midwest that you could confuse with emerald ash borer. But it needs to fit on a penny. It needs to be smaller than a penny for it to be a positive emerald ash borer. So for instance, all of these things have been turned into the university extensions, and this image comes from Minnesota, but a lot of them apply to Iowa here too. And even things like annual cicadas are being submitted as potential emerald ash borers. This is the far and away the most common imposter that people think, the tiger beetle. I made that mistake many years ago before I knew better, but I found these guys, two-line chestnut borers and bronze birch borers, are native insect borers that are in the same genus as emerald ash borer. So they're in the Agrylus genus, and they are metallic. They're just a little more olive colored or bronze colored than they are green. But definitely a lot of imposters out there, and some of you have probably seen Japanese beetles before if you have rose bushes or plums or apples or crab apples. This is the picture that shows the woodpecker activity, and it's really amazing to me. It's very zebra striped. They call it flecking because they're chipping away the bark or chiseling away the bark, the outer bark, and getting at, and so you see that contrast between dark and light. So most of this activity, I would guess, is happening in the winter months or fall. Emily, when would the woodpeckers be most, maybe during migration?
Any time of year. Most woodpeckers stay here year-round. So any time of year, but you'll probably notice it more when the leaves are off of the tree. So in the wintertime, it'd probably be easier to see.
Yeah, and that was when this picture was taken by my coworker Jeremy down in Eddyville, and he found it there. So yeah, you don't see this, you never saw this from woodpeckers until emerald ash borer arrived on the scene, or very infrequently, I think, the way that it distinctively marks up those trees. And then the D-shaped exit holes, again, that just has to do with the body shape of the emerald ash borer. The long-running joke in the tree world is that the emerald ash borer is shaped like a middle-aged male, which has a flat back and a round belly, and so when they chew out of the tree, that's the shape of the hole that they leave.
Thanks.
The other thing that's unique, when we see these trees start to die from emerald ash borer, the bark starts to peel off in slabs, and that's one of the ways we look for it is we peel the bark or pull it off, and it has this very distinctive S curve, back and forth serpentine pattern to it. Other types of wood-boring insects that get into ash trees, and there are, when you have an ash tree that gets old and starts to die, or if it gets hit by lightning and starts to die, or just growing in an unhealthy environment, lots of other native insects will get into it and start leaving holes in the bark, tunneling through it. They're basically secondary killers of the tree, and they work on recycling and decomposing the dying tree. But none of those leaves the back and forth meandering pattern that emerald ash borer does. They'll either do straight lines or they'll do random curly cues or whatever, but this one is unique to that larvae. So if you're seeing any of these signs or symptoms, Or if you actually find, at this point, I'm just telling people, look for that green bug, because a lot of these symptoms are very easily confused with other natural insects in our world. But this is the one-stop clearinghouse for where we want calls to go to try to vet those calls and then get the local person out to look at them, whoever can get there the fastest between the DNR or the IDAL's staff. So that's, and by the way, if you don't know about the ISU Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic, it's a really great resource if you're trying to figure out what's going on with your trees or your tomatoes, or if you find an insect in your home or garden that you don't know what it is. They've got a nice website, tons of pictures, lots of educational information, and you can even send them samples like leaf samples or twigs, and they can run laboratory diagnostics for very, very cheap and test if you have oak wilt, for instance. They can test for that, pine wilt, and other maladies. We do have effective treatments, preventative treatments for the most part, to save your ash tree from dying from emerald ash borer. I always like to tell people, these do a great job of keeping your tree from dying from emerald ash borer, but they don't do anything to stop your tree from dying of lightning strikes, windstorms, ice, and old age. So keep in mind that everything dies in their biological organism, and with that in mind, it is a really important lesson to before you just jump right into the expensive treatment game, to look at the quality of your tree and kind of predict how much longer you think it's going to be around anyways. Because if you don't think that tree is going to live more than 10 or 15 years anyhow, you might just be better off removing the whole tree and replacing it. But I always start by cutting off your decision criteria by the size of the tree. So, okay, diameter at breast height of the tree, breast height being 4.5 feet up from the ground. That's where our industry standard is to measure the diameter of the tree. So diameter is all the way across the surface of the cut stump. If you're going to measure it yourself, you could wrap a measuring tape around the perimeter and divide by 3.14 to get the diameter. That's Ray, you were a science teacher, right? Geometry lesson, but if your tree is 20 inches in diameter breast height or larger, then you treating your own tree is out. You can't do it. All of the products that would be required to treat that tree are restricted use pesticides and have to be applied by a certified licensed applicator, unless you happen to be one of those.